All right, folks, why don't we get started? Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Harry Kazianis. I'm Director of Defense Studies here at the Center for the National Interest. I'm also Executive Editor of the National Interest magazine. I welcome you all to talk about North Korea and the Olympics, something I never thought that would kind of get meshed together into one topic, but here we are nonetheless. Speaking for myself, and especially as someone who watches everything North Korea does as much as I possibly can, you know, if somebody told me, you know, back just a few months ago or in 2017 that we'd be talking about Pyongyang not only joining the Winter Olympics, but marching into the Olympic Stadium under a joint flag, you know, considering everything that happened in 2017, you know, countless missile tests, a hydrogen bomb test in September, I basically would have told them they were crazy. But like I said, here we are. But this is North Korea, and to be honest, there really isn't anything that shocks me anymore. I have no shock value left at this point. But I do think we have some valid questions that I think we need to ask today. How did we get here with North Korea? Is there any way we could have stopped Pyongyang from acquiring the nuclear weapons and missile arsenal that they have, short of war? You know, we're talking a lot about bloody noses and these type of things. So I think it's an important question to ask. How will the Olympics go? Will there be any provocations on North Korea's part? I think it doesn't seem likely, but you know, we never know. There's talk today about Mike Pence having maybe some sort of meeting with the North Koreans. It just broke from Josh Rogan, so I think that's an open question. What happens after the games? I think that's actually probably the biggest question, especially come April when the North Koreans have proven they love to test a lot of missiles in April. You know, last year they tested 3 times the Hwasong-12 intermediate range ballistic missile. You know, how will the United States respond, especially as the United States and South Korea are set up to do joint military exercises, which were actually delayed because of the Olympics. So I think these are some open questions I think we need to talk about. So to answer those, I have 2 good friends and colleagues here with me today who are going to give you their detailed analysis on these issues. First, to set the scene a little bit and explain, you know, how we got here and what we should expect during the games, is a good friend of mine, Bruce Klinger. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I think many of you know him well. Bruce holds a record of 20 years of experience at the CIA and the DIA. From 1996 to 2001, Bruce was the CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. In the mid-1990s, he was Chief of the CIA's Korea branch, which analyzed military developments during one of the nuclear crises with North Korea. After Bruce, we've got our own Lieutenant General Chip Gregson, who serves as Senior Director for our China and the Pacific program here at the Center. General Gregson retired from the Marine Corps in 2005 and last served as Commander, U.S. Marine Corps Forces Pacific. From 2009 to 2011, he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Security Affairs under the Obama administration. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Harry, and it's a pleasure to be here and be here with all of you. Yeah, I see my role today as kind of I'm General Gregson's warm-up band. I'll kind of explain all the problems, and then he'll solve them all. So, you know, if we look back just on the past year, you know, I think in the words of the great international relations specialist, the Grateful Dead, what a long, strange trip it's been. And if you get that illusion, then you're of a certain age. You know, I think kind of cutting to the chase, you know, saying the butler did it up front, I think we are closer to potential conflict on the peninsula than we've been since 1994. Now, that's not saying it's going to happen, it's imminent, that, you know, there's a 99% chance. It's because of both North Korea's growing military capabilities, particularly the, you know, near completion of the ability to hit the American homeland, but then also potential policy options that the Trump administration is talking about, namely preventive attack. So to sort of step back a bit, first on the North Korean capabilities, as Harry pointed out, we had, I've lost track of how many launches last year. I was trying to, you know, keep a listing, and it just sort of, there were so many, I got behind. You know, but we had all these launches, and it's important to distinguish that some of them are developmental testing, and others are of deployed system where they're exercising, and they're exercising the war plan. So on the second half, you know, you see things like when they test a Nodong medium-range ballistic missile, and then as we're trying to figure out why did they do that, the next day they very helpfully say, well, yeah, you know, not so many-me watch the launch, and we were practicing a nuclear airburst over the South Korean port of Busan, through which U.S. forces would be flowing in time of conflict. And then when they launch 4 extended-range Scuds towards Japan, we were practicing nuclear airbursts over U.S. bases in Japan, and then they have these very helpful maps that show the range ring and like, oh, Iwakuni. So they're exercising the war plan that Kim Jong-Un directed be put into place when he came into power. So the plan is to occupy Seoul within 3 days, the peninsula within 7. So they are exercising a plan. The other tests were developmental, and we've had the Hwasong 12 and the 14 and the 15. So right now the capabilities are North Korea has the ability today to hit all of South Korea and Japan with nuclear weapons. I don't think there really is any disagreement on that. They're working on, so they've miniaturized, they've been able to mate it to the Nodong, perhaps the Scud ER. They're continuing to work on 2 IRBMs to be able to hit Guam, obviously a key node in the U.S. defense of the Pacific. When I met with North Korean officials last year in Europe, they said both of those would soon be deployed to military units. And then, obviously, the ICBM, which has gotten the most attention in the U.S., 2 different versions. And so they've launched them to the very high trajectory, but if you extrapolate distance, they can hit all the way down to Mar-a-Lago. And then, so with the IRBM and the ICBM, we still have questions as to, have they, is it a full, viable, up-and-running system? We don't know. But I think at this point you can see enough quotes from 4-star generals, the CIA director, and others that we're really kind of splitting hairs as to is it today, tomorrow, next month, or a few, handful of months. And what I've noticed over the years really is a tendency to kind of downplay North Korean capabilities. So in the mid-90s, there were some even in the U.S. intelligence community who were saying you can't prove they have fissile material from plutonium. Well, they did. And then the highly enriched uranium program was dismissed as a figment of George Bush's imagination until you can no longer deny it. The attack on the Syrian reactor was dismissed by some as it was a Scud missile site until you couldn't deny it. And now you still have I think it's several years away before North Korea has a capability, and I've been saying that for several years. So, again, we don't know where they are, but it's real close on the ICBM capability. As they get closer to that ability, and I think it would take a long-range test with a clearly survivable RV to kind of prove to people that, yes, they do have that capability, and now aren't we shocked that there's ICBMs and gambling going on in the casino. So in response, that's driven the administration to be talking about a preventive attack. And that really is an issue that sucked the air out of the room for Korea watchers the last year. So we all talk to people in the inside, we all compare notes, and really for the last year it's been a case of almost every day you call a counterpart, and it's sort of, hey, I'm less nervous than I was before because I just talked to somebody on the inside. And the response may be, well, I just talked to someone else and I'm more nervous. Oh, thanks, talk to you tomorrow. And when I was in Seoul 2 weeks ago, I was contacted by a senior official in the Korean government who wanted to meet with me and another American colleague separately, basically to say, we're really nervous. We are very concerned about the potential for the U.S. conducting a preventive attack. And so then when I come back and compare notes, other Korea watchers are equally nervous. So as I said, it's sort of an up and down lowering of our tension levels. So, on the one hand, don't get your helmets and your bottle of scotch and hide under the bed yet, but it is something that we are very much concerned with. And you can argue whether it's all part of a brilliant good cop, bad cop policy, or I think if you look at the public statements which mirror private statements, a lot of contradictory comments coming from senior officials. So it does seem that there are divisions within the administration, and I think all of the Korea watchers will point out why we don't think a preventive attack is a good option, and we can go into that in more detail. Sort of turning to the inter-Korean relations. Every year North Korea does a New Year's Day speech. And for those of us who have been doomed to read them for the last 24 years, there's usually not too much that's different. But a lot of times you get sort of breathless calls, from other, younger watchers, and everyone's looking younger to me now, or media sort of saying, oh my God, North Korea just said they're going to turn us into a sea of fire. And it's like, well, if you read sort of the whole phrase, it's sort of, if the U.S. does this, we will whack you back. So a lot of times the threat reports they're sort of not unusual, but it's also kind of taking some things out of context. And the other is North Korea said something nice about the U.S. or South Korea, or they didn't say something nearly as bad as before. So does this mean they've turned over a new leaf? And I'm usually sort of the cynic or the skeptic in the room and point out that, well, in 2009, they were less critical of the U.S., and that was seen as a clear indicator they were going to act differently under Obama than Bush. And then we had 3 months later a long-range missile test and then a nuke test. 2010, they were less critical of South Korea, and that was going to be the harbinger of improved relations. Then we had those, little pesky things like the sinking of the ship and the shelling of the civilian island. So I tend to be kind of skeptical that anything really has changed in those messages. So this year, like every other year, there's an olive branch to the compatriots in the South. This year, what was different? They did mention the Olympics because it's happening this year, unlike other years. But what I think was different is that the South Korean president more quickly and eagerly grabbed at the olive branch than his predecessors. So then now you have the spectacle of the Olympics. Again, in my skeptical mode, we've been down this path before, so I'm not very hopeful that it'll lead to a reconciliation between the Koreas. It's sort of like the security guard at the gates of the Olympic camp is radioing back to headquarters saying, the North Koreans are pushing this large wooden horse. You're sort of like, again? We've seen that one before. So when people are fearful of a wedge being driven, we're sort of aware that that's their objective. So I'm not as concerned about a wedge perhaps as some others have been. And we think in the Olympics, they did have the October 2014 Asian Games in South Korea. It didn't lead to an improvement in relations. It had, a senior delegation from the North. The Sydney Olympics, which occurred 6 months after the historic Inter-Korean Summit, you had the same, visual of the two teams coming in behind a unification flag, wearing the same uniform, marching 2 by 2. Behind that, there was a story. There was South Korea was asked to pay a secret payment. They did. South Korea was asked to pay for the uniforms in the North. They did. And because the North didn't want to be outnumbered, and you had 162 North Koreans and 500 South Koreans, you had 350 ticked-off South Korean athletes and coaches who had to watch the opening from the stands or the parking lot. So, I don't think there's a secret payment this year, but we've been down this path before. So, I don't know how well it's going to lead to a great improvement. So, spoiler alert, I'm skeptical that there's going to be a major change in inter-Korean relations. But for solving it and the looking to the future, I'll let that be General Gregson's role.
The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thanks for the challenge, Bruce.
Welcome, sir.
Right now, the initiative rests with Kim Jong-Un. The regime's survival is only one step for what he wants. What he wants to do is unify the peninsula under the red banner. It's the family business, and it's something that they have frequently said. One way to get there, to the reunification under the North, is to damage our alliances. Kim will use nuclear blackmail after the Olympics, just as before, against the U.S. as a shield for increased coercion and intimidation. Things like the 2010 attack on the Chunnan that killed 46 sailors, or the 2010 attack on Pyongyang-do with 5 people killed. They will object to the resumption of combined exercises, and we've already set the precedent of trading a UN-endorsed activity, practicing collective defense for South Korea, for a UN-sanctioned capability, North Korea's continued testing program. North Korea has political opportunity because less than 20% of South Koreans have confidence President Trump will do the right thing in world affairs. That's by Pew polling. In the last year, we've broken international agreements, we've induced trade friction with South Korea, and we've personalized the dispute with Kim without any mention of the stakes that our allies have in this. President Moon of South Korea has much stronger support on the left than on the right. Bloody nose attack, you got to believe it's real. It's in Kim's interest to act like it's real as it increases his importance and that of his military. President Moon believes it's real because his constituents believe it's real. Then the Moon government, in reaction, is moving closer to China. And Robert S. McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, I think, would have endorsed this bloody nose option because it's similar to the tactics that they used to get North Vietnam to quit the war. Our way ahead is understand that Kim's strongest card is the potential use of nuclear weapons. If used, actually used, North Korea is finished. Diplomacy alone is not going to solve this. Dialogue with North Korea is going to be necessary and even advisable, but there's no realistic formula for successful activity by diplomacy alone. We also have to remember that there are problems to be solved and problems to be managed. This falls into the second category, something that George Shultz, when he was Secretary of State, called gardening. We need to be in this for the long term. Countering coercion, countering North Korean coercion entails risk. And we must all agree that actively countering North Korea is less risky than the passive deterrence that we have practiced since the inception of North Korea's nuclear program in 93-94. 94 was another occasion where we were seriously considering preemptive attack, but we decided against it because of the damage that our allies would take. We also have to recognize that North Korea is not a country as we think of countries, not conventionally. It is a global criminal enterprise run by the family at the center of the enterprise. Global criminal enterprise. And their global activities, both overt and covert, sustain the regime and enable their global criminal activities for profit. What are the elements of a strategy that you might use? Number one, enhance and expand the financial sanctions, both primary and secondary. Conduct maritime interdiction operations against ships we're already tracking, and we, in this case, being us and our allies. Increase the capabilities of our two most directly affected allies with missile defense and air defense at the top of the list, but don't limit it to that. Notify China while we're doing this, frequently and publicly, that if they cannot or will not help us restrain North Korea, that we have no choice but to do so, despite the fact that they may have objections. Make it about our vital interest in this case and not their interest. Repair relations with Seoul. We need an ambassador there. No more gratuitous trade friction. Eliminate ammunition, training, and readiness shortfalls in our forces in Westpac. Update counter-provocation strategies with South Korea and increase diplomatic, economic, military, intelligence, and law enforcement pressure to deter other states from tolerating North Korean criminal operations. Thank you.
Thank you, General Gregson. So I'm going to open it up in a minute to the floor for Q&A, but with great moderator privilege, I'm going to ask a question, and then we can open it up. So this morning I happen to be scrolling through Twitter, which I use to go pretty much all my news on North Korea these days, which is great. And I came across one article from North Korean media. I forgot the source, but it talked a little bit about the North Koreans worrying about, preemptive strikes. And they made some sort of comment, and I'm greatly paraphrasing here, that the North Koreans could launch their own preemptive attack. So I wanted to ask both of you, this is something I get asked a lot in my own media interviews, do you see any scenario, Bruce or Chip, where the North Koreans would consider preemptive attack and actually launch one? I'm just curious.
Yeah, first, just definition. We've got retaliatory, preemptive, and preventive attacks. So just to kind of lay those out. And retaliatory and preemptive have always been a part of U.S. strategy, and they're consistent with international law and the UN Charter. Preventive is sort of this third thing that's being layered. On preemption, I'm not so concerned that Kim is going to wake up some morning and in a rage of madness, hit the button and send missiles towards the U.S. I'm more concerned over what's been traditional concerns of escalation and miscalculation, but I think now they're on steroids. So with escalation, it can be Corporal Kim's walking along the DMZ, he trips, his rifle drops, a bullet goes off. Next thing you know, you have machine gun fire, artillery, kind of all these kind of things going on, or an incident in the West Sea. So it can be escalation, and when we saw with the landmine incident and purported artillery fire at loudspeakers, which led to a 3-for-1 North Korea or South Korean response, and that kind of thing can escalate. And I remember talking to General Sharp when he was the commander on the peninsula after the Cheonan, asking, well, how will the U.S. and South Korea respond? And he said that's a political decision. But he said something that stayed with me. He said, even if we do a tactical response that's constrained in duration, geographic location, and lethality, we have to be prepared to go all in, meaning an all-out war on the peninsula. The other thing is miscalculation. And I was struck by in September 2016 when the South Korean Minister of Defense said, oh, by the way, we've got a special forces unit whose mission is to decapitate the North Korean leadership, and we've also got surface-to-surface missiles, we've got F-15Ks, and we will launch those if we detect that North Korea is about to attack us, preemption. Well, North Korea responded with I got your preemption right here. We will preempt your preemption if we, with our terrible reconnaissance assets, perceive that you are about to do something, we will launch first. And so when you get kind of the 8 or 9 page grumpygram, right during the time of annual military exercises, where they say, well, you must be about to, be preparing to attack us because, look, you've got SEAL Team 6 who took out bin Laden, and why would you have that here other than to take out Kim Jong-Un, and, the long list of military units. Did that reflect that they really do think they are about to be attacked, and that, after we've done it however many times, the next one will be the real one? Or is it just, we need to complain about something? So, I think you have the danger that either Korea could preempt, perhaps based on poor intel, and then, the U.S., now that there's the growing concern about a threat to the homeland, is, if you have that poor scenario, or the poor intel analyst bursting into the Oval Office saying, sir, we've got, we think, pretty good intel that we see a number of missiles in the field. It is a time of heightened tension. We know they're fueled and they're erect. We think that they are nuclear tipped, and we think the leadership intention is they're about to attack as opposed to a signal or a military exercise. Over to you, sir. The U.S., any U.S. president may feel they have to lean further forward in that situation where in the old days when they didn't have nukes that could hit the U.S., maybe we could let the situation develop. But now, can you risk having 6 H-bombs coming at you if you see 6 missiles? So there's a danger the U.S. could preempt, and again, maybe on poor intelligence. So, I think setting aside the whole preventive issue, I think there is a greater, potential for miscalculation with much more dire consequences.
Penny, for your thoughts, sir?
Korea's the land of lousy options, as Victor Cha has famously said, but it's also the land of different vocabulary. It was a police action when we started it, and some of that manifests itself. And would North Korea attack? Well, it depends on your definition of attack. A partial list, they attacked the Blue House in Korea, their equivalent of the White House. They attacked the cabinet in the city formerly known as Rangoon when they were there on a visit. On the anti-U.S. side, they seized the USS Pueblo. They shot down a C-131 reconnaissance plane that was in international waters. They murdered Major Art Boniface in the Joint Security Area, and in the WMD category, last year at this time, they deployed VX to Kuala Lumpur Airport and employed it. And it was a sophisticated enough attack that they didn't kill crowds, and VX is a crowd killer, that they only killed Kim Jong-Nam, the brother. So it depends on what you call an attack. Yes, so they're perfectly capable of attack, and they're perfectly capable of a preemptive attack with weapons of mass destruction. Kim's VX attack demonstrated both will and skill. And also, oh, by the way, serve notice to a number of governments that if these governments do something to irritate North Korea, that North Korea can reach out and touch them. Recall that the UN sanctions list gave countries hosting North Korean laborers 2 years to send the North Korean laborers home. Let me opine that 2 years is not a realistic time frame for this deterrence challenge. That's basically giving it a free pass in the hopes that everybody will forget about it 2 years from now. So he's accomplished his objective once again.
Well, on that cheery note, I will bring it over to Q&A. I just ask that everybody just give your name and affiliation, and we have mics on left and right, so we'll get to you. So
when you're misquoted, we can correct the record.
There you go. Dimitri, please.
As a practical matter, does anyone on the panel believe that there is a combination of pressure and accommodation that could persuade Kim to give up his nuclear and missile program?
There's not a lot of optimism, really, when it comes to North Korea. But, you know, in a way, that's like saying, do you really think if you keep arresting people that you will eliminate crime in Washington, D.C.? It's like, well, no, but I think it's a better likelihood if I continue this policy of pursuing those that are in violation of law resolutions. And it also doesn't mean I just abandon all hope, because sanctions and targeted financial measures are serving a number of purposes. I'd argue that they're upholding the law, U.S. law, defending our financial system, because the vast majority of all international transactions in the world, including North Korea's, are denominated in dollars, which means they come through U.S. Treasury Department regulated banks in the United States, and that's still happening, according to the UN panel of experts. So you're upholding U.S. law, you're upholding international law, you're upholding the resolutions. If they mean anything, you have to uphold them. 2, you're imposing a penalty of pain on those that are violating those resolutions. 3, you're putting in place measures to make it harder for them to import items they need for their prohibited programs, including money from illicit activities. 4, you're putting in place measures to make it harder for them to proliferate. And 5, along with all the other instruments of national power, you're trying to get them to behave themselves and comply with the resolutions, et cetera. So I would argue that you're more likely to get to and I would argue we're successful on four of the 5. The 5th is very difficult. Diplomacy also didn't succeed in getting them to, cut up their last nuclear weapon. But, I'd say look at the Iran deal. Whether you like the deal or not, the way we got there was through pressure and leaving a door open to diplomacy. So I hope to get there, but in the meantime, it's fulfilling a number of other objectives. And, while you hope those instruments will get them to kind of come to the table in a meaningful way, you also have sufficient defenses for yourself and your allies.
I don't think there's any way that we are going to convince Kim Jong-Un to abandon his nuclear program, let alone give up the weapons. He can't. He's a brutal autocratic leader. He's got to always be crusading against something. He's already managed to murder in a particularly grisly fashion members of his family and members of his inner circle. He can't be seen to compromise because the same fate would happen to him. If by some reason he escaped internal retributions, the United States has been quite clear about sending him to The Hague and all these things, and there's no reason for him to doubt that we won't think that's a good idea again if he manages to try and surrender. Back to my point about gardening and problems that are not to be solved quickly. When the Soviet Union exploded its atomic weapon in 1949, I don't think we saw any way we were going to talk the Soviet Union out of giving up their nuclear program. But what we did do was create a global strategy that was primarily diplomatic, political, and economic, with a military component as necessary to contain the Soviet Union. The analogy is not exact, but what we're into is containment here of the North Korean threat. And what's most important in that containment is the territory, the interest, and the lives of our allies and friends, and their faith that we can handle matters intelligently and that we're not going to start something that causes a conflict where they would take the vast majority of the damage. I submit we're in some danger of that now. Along with the other things I mentioned on our strategy, I neglected to mention that we need to ramp up the same type of worldwide global information campaign that was so successful for us during the Cold War. The North Korean citizens have much more capability to understand what's going on in the outside world than they ever did before. The march of globalization has even touched North Korea, and communication means we need to get back to talking about the city on the hill. We need to go back and look at Ronald Reagan's Human Rights Day speech, and we need to start talking and living like we're doing that, and then let the internal dynamics in North Korea work their will. It might be 10 years, it might be 100 years. Recall that in 1989, we were surprised when the Soviet Union fell. We might not even know this is coming, but land of lousy options. Every option to solve the North Korean problem by next Thursday is a lousy option. Quit trying to solve it immediately. Quit trying to solve it by any time certain. Quit trying to solve it by the next election, either off year or general, and settle down and realize that the safety, the security, and the serenity of our allies is the most important thing that we can provide Asia here, and we need to get on with that.
So I had Danny Davis, then you, sir, and then ma'am.
Daniel Davis from Defense Priorities. I got a question that has both a diplomatic and a military component, so please answer as you see fit.
Make sure the hard part goes to Bruce.
Yeah, there's a land of lousy options. There's no good ones, apparently.
And lousy analysts. Yeah.
Definitely not that. My concern is in terms of positions that we've had. I think you both alluded to a second ago. Maybe we're using. What's the word I'm looking for? The president's been making all these claims and stuff, but it's really just bluffing, and they're trying to force whatever. It seems to me that we've painted ourselves into a bit of a corner, and I'm wondering how you think we could not fall into the trap. So whether it's Lindsey Graham or President Trump or H.R. McMaster, several of them said, we will not allow them to have the capability to hit the United States with a nuclear warhead. So if it becomes evident that through whatever test that they actually have that ability, or let's say it's April, May, June timeframe, whatever, and they actually conduct another nuclear test, and are we going to say, all right, well, actually we didn't mean that, we're not actually going to do anything, or are we going to be forced into doing something, and what's the cost if we don't do something? But then militarily, if we do and we're flat-footed, we can't just build up. Because then that would signal, and then it seems to get even worse than what we have now. How would we respond to that?
I've got an op-ed in work that I think I list about 10 reasons why preventive attack is not a good idea, and one of them is we seem to be painting ourselves in a corner. So I mean, North Korea, you could argue, has already crossed two red lines of the administration. They're going to do an ICBM test. It's not going to happen, and it did. If they threaten us again, then fire and fury, which one newspaper that they obviously need a new copy editor, the title was Fire and Furry, which after I said that, I was always afraid, oh, God, when I go on an interview, I'm gonna do it wrong. And then obviously they've continued to threaten us. So as you point out, if we've had numerous statements by senior officials that if North Korea reaches a technological capability that we consider dangerous, military options are on the table, intolerable, it's kind of a long list of things where it's them having that capability. Now, what would be a trigger point for a preventive attack? Is it, they do a long-range test, say over Japan to some impressive distance in the Pacific. They clearly demonstrate an RV capability. Is it that? Is it a nuclear airburst? Is it the poor intel guy bursting in and saying, the 16 intel agencies, or 17, we're all in agreement, next Tuesday they have the capability? Is that a trigger? Or do you say, well, it's, one test does not a capability make, it needs to be deployed. Well, maybe it's not one deployed. So you don't know, is it a slippery red line or a slippery slope of red lines, or is it we've painted ourselves into a corner? If they demonstrate it, is it now, and if you don't act, is it then like Obama's red line on Syria that he didn't act on, and then allies question our resolve and credibility? So I think that's one of the downsides if you do lay out the capability as basically your trigger point.
You posit a very difficult dilemma. One of the things that has been said, along with many other things that have been said, is that all military options are on the table. And I submit that we have left one doable military option off the table by neglect, and that's enhanced deterrence. Start from 1993 and walk it forward, and what you pretty much have is passive deterrence on the part of the United States. We've watched one outrage after another, and if you try and list things that we've done differently since 1993 in Westpac with our military forces, it's still roughly the same, except for withdrawals. So we have not been reacting. Now, North Korea has profoundly changed the status quo. I submit that it's time for us to change it back in our favor by vastly enhancing our deterrent capability. And one way to do it that helps solve the dilemma of what you do if they do have a missile that can reach the United States is that we gain the capability to do boost phase intercept over North Korea. Boost phase has gotten sort of a bad reputation because they're trying to solve it by lasers, and that's proven to be exceptionally difficult. You can do boost phase intercept with kinetic interceptors, but we don't have the right gear right now to do that. You can, in theory anyway, put a constellation of unmanned aerial systems above international waters just off of the North Korean part of the peninsula. That's your surveillance to detect missiles as soon as they enter the boost phase, and you have something up there carrying missiles capable of enough speed to get to that missile while it's still in boost phase, whether we're able to develop lasers or not. Then we sort of finesse this about we're not going to stand for North Korea having the capability to reach the United States by being able to shoot down missiles over their own territory. So there's a lot of things we can do. The bottom line being that North Korea is not the only one in Asia, but North Korea has fundamentally changed the status quo, and we are admiring the problem rather than solving the problem.
Sorry, you and then ma'am.
Thank you. Steve Rademacher at Covington and Burling. I'm a little bit surprised that we've been talking for 30 or 40 minutes about North Korea, and I think I've only heard the name China mentioned once because usually when you get into these kinds of discussions and the focus is not just how do you sort of manage the problem, but rather how do you actually potentially go about solving it. The discussion pretty quickly comes to the question of China, and I think that's true even of the Trump administration. I mean, I think they've come to the same recognition as a lot of other people that really all their predecessors, that if there's going to be a solution, China's going to be central to achieving it. And so I wanted to invite you to comment about China's role, maybe just to trigger that. Do you agree that China has the wherewithal, the capability to solve the problem if they choose to participate in that? If so, do you have anything to suggest about how we might motivate them to exercise that capability to help bring about a solution? And finally, if they can't be motivated to do that, what does that tell us about China's motivations and interests with respect to the North Korea problem?
China's got its own set of lousy options when they look at North Korea. They're not very fond of what North Korea is doing, but their interests do not coincide with ours. Xi Jinping's got a couple of problems. One, a heroic narrative about China's emergence from the century of humiliation includes their intervention in North Korea, and Mao Zedong's son is buried in a martyrs cemetery in North Korea, and Chinese officials visit it from time to time, so he can't very well walk away from it. Secondly, China does not want any democracy on its borders, whether it's flying the ROK flag or the U.S. flag, and so they can help. They can help a little bit, but the solution to North Korea does not run through China, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think obviously people point to the 90% of North Korea's economic activity is with China, and then either the idea being, well, what will China allow us to have? And I'd argue, as we go for what I say 3 lanes in the road of pressuring North Korea, one is better enforcement of the UN resolutions. The other is more vigorous enforcement of U.S. law. And the third is trying to pick off North Korea's economic partners, even legitimate ones. And the third one is, you go to folks, as we did with Banco Delta Asia, when U.S. officials went throughout Asia, and you sort of say, I'm not putting you on any list. Nice place you got here. Love what you did with the drapes. I'm not putting you on a list, but did you know under Section 311 of the Patriot Act, if you are found to be complicit, then you will be sanctionable. And nowadays, it also has as a new twist of, do you want your business, your reputation linked to a regime that is, committing crimes against humanity, state sponsors of terrorists, these overseas worker and slave conditions? That's who you want your business relationship linked with? Have a nice day. And we're seeing sort of a running list of countries and companies and businesses and banks that are saying, you're right, I don't want to deal with them. And so we have a steadily constricting circle or noose on North Korea. On that second part is enforcing U.S. law. As I mentioned again, because of the centrality of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. financial system to the international community, we have unique leverage that other countries don't. So, if you send money from Paris to London, it goes through New York. It doesn't look like it, but it does, and that gives us a lot more leverage than people think. So as I said, the UN panel of experts says the majority of North Korean transactions are still denominated in dollars, and Chinese entities that are facilitating the prohibited behavior, the same is true. And there's been a lot of great work by outside, non-government organizations, C4ADS and others, where they've identified sort of the 2,500 Chinese entities dealing with North Korea, and then the, I think, 30 trading companies that have majority control over those things, and then the 10 individuals that control the 30 holding companies. It's like, why aren't we going after them and for violating U.S. law, money laundering, et cetera? Congressman Ed Royce, head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, provided a list to the White House of 12 Chinese banks that we think there's evidence for committing crime or violating U.S. law. 0 have had action taken against them by the administration. So we're doing more against some Chinese entities, but we're still pulling our punches on defending the U.S. financial system and upholding U.S. law. So we don't need Chinese permission to go after those that are coming into our financial system breaking our laws. So I think we're unnecessarily pulling our punches and not going after those that are doing transgressions on our soil.
Miss, please, right, you have a question.
I'm Karen DeYoung with the Washington Post. I wanted to go back to the good cop, bad cop reference, and whether you see that as a sort of witting strategy or absence of a strategy or a policy, particularly on the question of talks. You've had the administration, various senior members of the administration, including the president, being on pretty much all sides of that issue. Just this week we saw Secretary Tillerson said, we'll see, maybe there'll be talks. You had the White House respond to that by saying absolutely not. You had Pence today say, we'll see. Does any of that make any difference? What conceivably would be accomplished with talks, if anything? And if we're talking about a return to six-party talks, if we're talking about bilateral talks, again, the administration has been on all sides of preconditions. Is denuclearization a precondition? Is it a goal? Is it a what? How do you see the whole question of talks, and should we, as we do in the media, kind of pounce on it every time somebody asks a question and gives an answer, whatever that is?
I don't have any objection to talks. As a matter of fact, I think they are necessary, especially as if we get moving on it, if we start applying more and more pressure on North Korea. I do object to talks if we think that just talks by themselves, without changing anything else, are going to somehow convince Kim to abandon his nuclear program. I think that's fantasy. I hate to keep. I probably shouldn't keep bringing up historical things, but we talked to the Soviet Union all the way through the Cold War. So most of the time we won or came out of the talks okay. There were some famous times when we thought that we didn't do well. for the same reason, and for the reason of we need to do the same thing here. And if it also means that we are reassuring our allies by having talks instead of frightening them by just refusing to have any engagement, then I think talks are definitely needed. We need to prioritize our allies and act accordingly, and I think talks are entirely realistic, especially if we don't like the subject. Even in Korea, you know, how long did the talks at Panmunjom go on? And there were some people that wrote some books about just how excruciating it was negotiating with the North Koreans then.
Yeah, I mean, some will argue it's part of a good cop, bad cop, totally integrated strategy. I don't see that. To me, it just seems the statements are so contradictory and confusing, you know, including senior officials basically contradicting themselves. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, which role were you in? So to me, it seems the statements are so contradictory that they're confusing. You know, I have a meeting later this afternoon with an embassy where the message was, can we please come and talk to you? We and our capital are confused as to what U.S. policy is. And this is an ally. And I've gotten a lot of those kind of things. So, I mean, it's kind of ego boosting, but it's also a little scary that embassies are coming to think tankers trying to find out what U.S. policy is. And we get lots of those requests, either when they're visiting from overseas or from in town. So I see it as more contradictory, confusing than, you know, kind of a well-lubricated machine of, you know, comprehensive strategy. On the talks, yeah, I'm open to talks, but I would distinguish between, you know, diplomat to diplomat discussion. I mean, that's their job, to talk to people you don't want to bring home to mom, and a resumption of formal negotiation. So on the talks, yeah, I mean, Jong-Un and Sung Kim and others have tried to talk with the North, and, you know, when one of them reached out, they were told, the New York Channel is closed, you shouldn't be calling us. And until recently this year, with the new Charm Offensive, North Korea literally did not pick up the military hotline in the joint security area, which led to U.S. and South Korean military officers with a bullhorn standing on the military demarcation line saying, please empty your mailbox. We want to have a meeting Thursday at 10. Please come. And then they don't. And the same with the West Sea hotline. So it's hard to have dialogue with someone that refuses to talk to you. And the UN official that just came back from Pyongyang a couple weeks ago, he said, you know, the message from North Korea was, we're not ready to talk to the U.S. yet. So, you know, I kind of jotted down, I think, 10 different components of what the policy should be, and one of them is leave the door open for diplomacy. But, you know, you can wait by the phone, but you also have to be doing other things, and it's the pressure that is trying to bring them back to the table in a meaningful way, and then you have the other components to kind of do deter, contain, long-term regime change, et cetera.
Just one P.S. on that. And Bruce mentioned the difficulty when the North refuses to talk. We've had the other problem too, that if we dash off to Pyongyang to have diplomatic discussions with North Korea without any other representative from South Korea along or Japan, that makes our allies really nervous. So again, we got to be careful about these talks, but it's necessary to keep contact with the North Koreans, as difficult as that is for the people that have to do it, so that we can detect any changes or any other things that might be useful.
And just one PPS. And something to talk about would be confidence and security building measures. It'd be sort of, hey, if you're so concerned with our military exercises, you're doing winter training cycle and summer training cycle every year that no one seems to know about, which are not on pause during the Olympics. Hey, if you're so concerned about our exercises, let's have discussions for, you know, notifications, transparency measures, like we did with the CSBM treaty in Europe or the CFE treaty delegation or CFE treaty in Europe, where it's like, okay, if we're going to have exercises with more than 10,000 troops, we have to give 14-day notification, things like that to increase the transparency, reduce the likelihood of miscalculation, And if you don't want to have those talks, well, then it really calls into question your complaints that you're really fearful about the exercises.
All right. And the gentleman with the beard, right in the center there. Yep, there you go. Thank you.
Jacob Cohn with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. I completely agree that a boost phase system would be a game changer. So assuming that we don't have a viable boost phase system, I'm curious what the panelists think about how North Korea views the U.S. extended deterrent guarantee. So consider a scenario where they've developed a deliverable ICBM, a warhead that could survive on an ICBM and deliver that to the U.S., and then there's some sort of a crisis for whatever reason. Could the North Korean regime think we can keep the U.S. out by using a nuclear weapon against, say, a South Korean or a Japanese target, knowing that they won't risk an nuclear ICBM flying at the U.S.?
That's a good one.
Well, that's the conundrum of this capability, and one should never doubt the U.S. guarantee of extended deterrence. But there is the question that, okay, if North Korea can reach out and force a trade of Los Angeles for whatever, then Kim succeeds at his blackmail, and he won't even have to go to that extreme. There are other ways that he can use the shield of his nuclear capability to hide behind. One alliance, maybe not breaker, but a potential world damager to the alliance is probably coming up in the wake of the Olympics, and that will be President Moon wanting to reopen the Kaesong industrial complex. An awful lot of money flows to South Korea from, an awful lot of money flows to North Korea from South Korean firms that are involved with the Kaesong industrial complex. But if our ally wants to do this, the last thing we want to do is object this out of hand. Moon is already hedging with China because less than 20% of his population trusts the U.S. to do the right thing. If we're going to have a genuine allied containment strategy in North Korea, if President Moon wants to reopen Kaesong, then I suggest we go along and we double down on this. We flood the zone in North Korea with South Koreans and maybe even Americans. Also insist on opening a counterpart down south. Many things like that. I mean, take it to its extreme and take what you can get. I'm told that when the Kaesong industrial complex was open, that we actually increased our intelligence take from North Korea. Well, that makes sense because we actually had South Koreans in North Korea. But again, hiding behind the nuclear shield here, I can see a scenario where President Moon wants to reopen the Kaesong industrial complex. We take some position that is absolutely against that. What does South Korea do? Nothing good. But we need to be able to do better than that. We need to have a little more deft diplomacy than we have in the past.
On extended deterrence, I mean, you have to, from the U.S. side, we have to make sure we have sufficient resolve and capabilities that it's credible. Allies are always nervous because they're having to rely for part of their security on someone else, the U.S. So they're always nervous, and it's almost sort of every few minutes. It's like, so you really are going to do that extended deterrence, right? Yes, yes, yes. And then it's 10 minutes later you have to do it again. But the last couple of years there have been increasing questions and concerns about U.S. guarantees. So, we saw it with the degradation in U.S. military capabilities brought on by sequestration, the Obama's non-fulfillment of the Syrian Red Line, some comments Mr. Trump made during the campaign about kind of conditionality of U.S. views of alliances and our commitment. And then some comments, by the administration. But and so what you hear, particularly in South Korea, is the, kind of the traditional fears of abandonment and entanglement, but much stronger. So you get as the U.S. is coming under threat of a nuclear attack or the capability from North Korea, would we really trade L.A. for Seoul? And I try to respond, it's like, well, we were willing to risk 100 million casualties in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, in essence risking L.A., New York, and Washington for Bonn, Paris, and London. We have treaty commitments, we have presidential statements, and we have deployed our most precious resource, 28,500 sons and daughters in uniform in South Korea, and also hundreds of thousands of civilians. So why do you doubt us? But they also are fearful of this preventive attack or entanglement of they're afraid we will risk Seoul for L.A. So there's sort of these conflicting things. So.
It's separate from how our allies view it. Does the North look at that and say,
right.
This is a real guarantee we need to respect, or do they think it's a joke?
Well, the problem with deterrence is the final decision is in the minds of your opponent, and you don't know. I mean, they've been deterred up till today. So you have to make sure you have, sufficient or overly sufficient resources and resolve to hopefully deter them, but they always have the final say. On the resolve, I kind of like General Mattis's way of speaking very firmly but kind of quietly, as opposed to more kind of, I think extraneous, unnecessarily tough language. I think, if you go with General Mattis, it's a really strong sign of deterrence.
So, gentlemen with the blue blazer glasses right there. Yes, thank you. Coming right to you. Right behind you. Oh, one more. There you go. Thank you so much.
Oh, here.
Just trying to go in order as best
Okay.
I can. Thank you.
Stapleton Roy, Wilson Center. There have been some terrific comments by panelists. I think it set a very good context for discussion, but I'd be interested in panelists' comments on additional issues. Enhanced deterrence. There's a very high level of mistrust in China over their suspicion that we are using the North Korea issue as a way of enhancing our deterrence against China, and that North Korea is simply being used by us as a tool. General Gregson, I'd be particularly interested in the question of whether an enhanced deterrent aimed at North Korea does not degrade China's own capabilities in terms of their deterrent against us. Second issue, it's tempting to think about the actions against Chinese banks as something that might strengthen us, but I think it was a catastrophic error on the part of the George W. Bush administration to put the sanctions on Banco Delta Asia right after the September 19th, 2005 joint statement that came out of the six-party talks. They hadn't tested yet, that agreed to denuclearization, that agreed to rejoin the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we took an action that essentially aborted the possibility for forward progress. So if you're going to act against Chinese banks, it seems to me it has to be part of a well-thought-through strategy so that you're not taking an extraneous action that then follows up the larger picture. But that raises the third question. Are we capable of having a comprehensive strategy on North Korea, given the nature of our president, his propensity to speak along the lines that you hinted at in your last comment here, injudiciously, in contrast to Secretary Mattis, and given the fact that there's a very clear fundamental split in the administration between those who think that bluffing or really holding open the possibility of a kinetic option against North Korea, as opposed to those who think there is no such option. And that split exists at the highest level, and I don't see any indication that it's going to be resolved shortly. And that's a problem. The final issue is the question of alliance management. I find Americans constantly falling into the, what I call, delusion of thinking we can have a Korea strategy that isn't endorsed and worked out in conjunction with the Korean government, our ally. And our discussion here, unfortunately, has trended in that direction, that we can do this, we can do that. And our additional problem with our Korean ally is that there is not necessarily unanimity between the president and the military in Korea. And we have the temptation to want to use the Korean military to oppose a president who was democratically elected there with a population that has less than 20% confidence in us to begin with. And perhaps we need to pay a little more attention to having improved confidence in South Korea before we can have confidence that we know how to deal with North Korea. But I'd just be interested in your comments on these issues.
It always feel like it's having to orally defend a dissertation when Ambassador Roy is in the room. China most certainly would object to anything we do to enhance our deterrent posture in Northeast Asia. They have pretty solidly indicated that the presence of the theater high-altitude area defense in South Korea is worse for them than North Koreans' nuclear capability. Nevertheless, I still think that there's a way through this. Confidence-building measures with China, et cetera, to be able to at least have discussions about the fact that this is not aimed at them. This doesn't have it has far more to do with protecting our vital interest and protecting our allies than it does anything with China. We got to be prepared to handle that, and it requires a degree of diplomatic skill that in your later questions you indicate you might not have a lot of confidence that we have. Comprehensive strategy, we have not done that well in the past. I'm encouraged that the recent national security strategy and national defense strategy are certainly a step in the right direction. We're actually being clear, I think. Whether we have the capability to follow through on that, we'll see. On alliance management, I think there's a lot to say for the fact the most important part of this whole episode with North Korea is our ability to strengthen our alliances, not just in the sense of more people with guns over there, not at all, but to strengthen our alliances diplomatically, politically, to enhance the confidence of the people of South Korea and the people of Japan that they can trust the United States. And the polling figures that I cited in South Korea are disturbing enough. Japan's better. It's between 20% and 30%. So reminds me of an anecdote towards the end of the Clinton administration. We were having a lot of trouble with our policy, Japan, South Korea, North Korea. Sandy Berger was testifying in front of the Senate, and he said, and it was a Friday afternoon, and he said, well, we'll appoint a special envoy, and that started the senators down the trail of who's it going to be, who's it going to be, who's it going to be. And finally, to get out of the hearing, and we were impinging on happy hour at this point, it was late enough, to get out of the hearing, Sandy Berger said, well, somebody like a Bill Perry. Hearing's over, everybody ran back to their offices, obviously went home because nobody thought to call Bill Perry. He picked up the newspaper the next day, San Jose Mercury News, showed up in Washington on Monday. He's mad as hell, and because nobody told him. So he gathered, some of you were probably in the room, a whole bunch of people gathered in one of the rooms at State Department, and everybody said our allies don't trust us, and he lectured us and said, you're wrong. And he flew off to Tokyo, went from Tokyo to Seoul, came back to Washington, gathered us all together again and lectured us. You know, our allies don't trust us. Yeah, we're in that situation now. And we need to fix this, and we need to make it far more, we need to make this whole episode far, far, far more about our allies and far less about North Korea, and quit personalizing this issue. It's the same mistake George W. Bush made when he offhandedly said, better dead or alive. So then it became a personal pursuit of Osama bin Laden. And no, he's one guy. And this is one guy here, and the United States is stronger than that, and we don't deal with tin pot dictators on a personal level. And we've done that. We've got to get away from personalizing this, and we've got to make it far, far more about our allies than about what Kim wants or what Kim did or what Kim said.
Yeah, as always, sir, you raise a lot of good points, and I won't do them justice. But on enhanced deterrence in China, I mean, my little lane in the road of Northeast Asia, on THAAD, we know what they were saying against the X-band radar was disingenuous. They knew it was disingenuous. They refused briefings from U.S. and South Korea. So, you know, in THAAD, we shouldn't, or, you know, luckily we weren't, deterred from deploying a defensive system in response to their allies' offensive actions. You know, we stayed the course. South Korea stayed the course. I'll leave it to others to talk about South China Sea and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, certainly on THAAD, they were trying to use that as an excuse for impinging on South Korea's sovereignty and national security. On the BDA and things, the timing may have been bad, but to turn the question around, it would be like, we had known for years they were violating U.S. law. How much longer would you want the U.S. government to turn a blind eye to people violating U.S. law? I would argue not long. So similarly, if we're pulling our punches now on Chinese entities or Singaporean entities that are violating U.S. law, misusing our financial system, I'm in favor of law. So, if you're a bank president, someone comes into your bank with suitcases of cash, you either know, you suspect, or you have to know under know your customer requirements that it's illicit activity. You're not only allowed to protect your bank, you're required by law to protect your bank. So similarly, if someone is coming into the U.S. Financial system physically or digitally, and they're like, hi, I got suitcases of cash, I'm money laundering, but I'm Chinese, it's okay. I don't see that as a good situation. So, for example, the U.S. has imposed $12 billion in fines on European banks for money laundering for Iran. We've imposed $0 on fines on any Chinese bank. So, if the big four Chinese banks are too big to designate, maybe you impose fines on them like we've done with Europe. On the comprehensive strategy, can we get the administration or any administration to do it? I mean, maybe that's why think tanks are in business. We think we can bring the lamp of knowledge to an administration. So, we all argue, perhaps contradicting each other, but we all are, pointing out strategies. Like I said, I have deter, contain, pressure on 3 different lanes, leave the door open for diplomacy, information operations, confronting them on human rights, law enforcement, sufficient defense for ourselves and our allies, strong coordination with our allies, and long-term regime change. And then, kind of on alliance management, actually, I think we're in a pretty good place with Moon Jae-in, better than I had expected. During the campaign and once he was president, he reversed himself on THAAD. He reversed himself on Kaesong, admitting it would be a violation without prior approval by the UN. He, said pressure, not engagement. So he shifted a lot. I think like Obama, who adopted a different North Korea policy than he intended because of North Korean actions and refusing to meet with them and all that. So, I'm nervous about Moon, but I think at least we're in a good starting place. He's more centrist on North Korea than I had thought. And when I was in Seoul meeting with folks, they were all saying the right thing about the exercises are not canceled, we're not naive. Yeah, I'm afraid he's going to cut left, but at least I feel like we're in a pretty good starting place.
All right, next I had Jacob Halbert on the back.
Thank you, Harry. I had a question for General Gregson, which is, let's say Donald Trump meets with you in the Oval Office and he listens to your advice that you've given today, and he says, that's all well and good. It's old hat. It's what we've heard for decades, but now I'm in the position of wanting to stop this from occurring, so I need the military options. Are you willing to live with a nuclear capacity of the North Koreans to strike the United States? That's the question I would have for you. You, as in General Gregson, are you ready to live with that outcome, which seems to be the most likely one? Or would you say that maybe Trump does have a point?
Recognizing that North Korea has been able to attain steel by the ballistic missile technology needed to reach the United States, and most assuredly has the capability within a very short time, if you're optimistic, to be able to put a warhead on that. Are we willing to live with it? Well, given the probable result and what the world would look like if we tried to prevent this, yes. We've done this before. We lived with the existential threat of the Soviet Union for, 1945 to 1989? And we didn't, I don't want to go back to the days of teaching grade school kids to duck and cover under their desks, but By the way, resilience is something that will be needed in this too, besides a counter-strike capability. Japan already does nationwide alerts. We tried one in Hawaii, but you know how that got screwed up. But the real thing about the real shocking thing about the Hawaii thing is, despite the fact that they have regular warnings about tsunamis and they have a pretty good infrastructure on where you go when there's a tsunami coming, high ground. Even though they'd had these alerts before, people discovered after the words "this is not a drill" were included in it that they had no idea what to do. Well, we got to do a little better than that. Japan has done better than that, so Japan is demonstrating more resilience than we are. I would never argue for recognizing, capital R in a diplomatic sense, North Korea as a nuclear armed state, but recognizing that they have the weapon is a different matter. And this gets back to the deterrence discussion again. We need to be able to deter in two ways. One, the ability to punish and finish North Korea should they use a nuclear weapon. But the other one that we got into a little bit on the boost phase discussion, boost phase intercept discussion, we need the ability to deter by denial, so that not only can they not reach the United States, they can't reach Japan either. South Korea, a different problem because of the conventional threat to South Korea, but South Korea has pretty much learned how to accommodate that.
Yeah, I would just add.
By the way, I do not anticipate an invitation to the Oval Office anytime soon.
As you point out, if it's a new option, I would say, well, the responsibility for explaining why we should do it is sort of rests on its proponents. And when you look at administration statements, it tends to be, North Korea is different from the Soviet Union / Russia and China. You have a crazy leader, and he's not deterrable. Okay, so if we whack him, whether it's 2 or 3 targets or something, how is he going to respond? He won't respond. He'll know it's the end of his regime. So sort of a sane, rational, logical response by someone who's now deterred from responding. To me, it seems like a logical disconnect. He's either crazy or he's not, and he's not. He's a terrible person, but he's not crazy. And he's either deterrable or he's not. So to me, that doesn't make sense. The other one is they will proliferate. I'd say sink the ship, or do something. You don't start a war to prevent a war, to prevent proliferation. Or he's not deterrable because he's a brutal, terrible dictator who's done terrible things to his people. It's like, well, Stalin, Mao, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, et cetera, were brutal, terrible people who did things, to their people, but we didn't launch an attack against Moscow or Beijing. Also, it'd be like, what are your objectives? Is it to remove the threat to the United States? In which case, if you're doing a bloody nose, and people in the government say no one's used that phrase, okay, 2 or 3 targets, they're not going to respond. Okay, have you removed the ICBM threat to the United States? No. But you've probably not started a war. You haven't caused them to pull 10,000 lanyards, shelling Seoul, but they will respond. They will probably respond with 2 or 3 USFK targets. Then, where are you then? The other thing is, okay, if you take out their ICBM capability, you've got a really long bombing list, and then you really are definitely in a full-scale war. And they're just kind of other things, the costs, the casualty estimates, strained in alliance. Do you do this kind of attack without consulting your allies? Think of the impact on the alliance. Or if you say, so we really want to do this, and they say, well, no. And as our president has publicly said, we have a veto. And if the U.S. responds, well, this is the American homeland, you don't have a veto, we're going to do it over your objections, what does that impact have on the alliance? So I just see kind of a long list of what I see as dangerous ramifications to something that I don't see as solving the problem.
All right. So next I'm going to go to our chairman, Chuck Boyd, and then I'm going to work around back this way. So if we can get the gentleman a microphone.
I'll talk loud. Simple soul.
There you go.
Question here on this shelling Seoul. For order of battle question for Greg. How many artillery pieces now within range of Seoul? 2, can you pull the string on them simultaneously? And 3, what's the range of casualty estimates?
The estimates I've seen on the number of artillery and rocket installations is 10,000 plus. Can you pull the lanyard on all these simultaneously enough? I don't think we should doubt North Korea's command and control over this. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of us thought that North Korea was finished because their money was finished. A lot of it dried up, but they made a very nice shift. They went from trying to maintain a force that could take the offensive and go south into one that could coerce everybody, including particularly South Korea, and they've done a pretty doggone good job. And the Kaesong Heights are a tough place to attack by any means. Do we know where a lot of the stuff is? Yes. Could we close ADITs with aerial bombing and our own artillery? Yes. Could we get it all? I don't know of anybody that's wearing a uniform over there that's willing to say that we can shut it down. It would be a fight.
And casualty range? Oh,
casualty range. There's 23 million people, I think, in the greater Seoul metropolitan area. Hundreds of thousands.
The Congressional Research Service just put out a report saying the estimates of 30,000 to 300,000 deaths in the first few days of a conflict, and that is without North Korea doing BCW or nuclear, and that's not counting if China comes into the game. 30,000 to 300,000 deaths in the first few days. Now, when I was in the government, we did war games and tabletop exercises. The alliance always won, but it was hundreds. What we saw was hundreds of thousands of casualties. That was the consistent number that came up every time we did a game. And that was before we really thought they had nuke weapons. So, look at comments by General Dunford and General Mattis of horrific, whatever the other phrases were. But I mean, they're well aware of what the costs would be.
And a gentleman on my left who's been waiting patiently. Thank you.
David Maxwell. I echo everything Ambassador Roy said about the alliance. And just specifically, though, if General Gregson or Bruce, from your recent visit, do you have any specific recommendations on how to repair the alliance? And the second point is Bruce has touched on human rights briefly, but President Trump has probably emphasized human rights more than any other president. It looks like the vice president is going to make human rights a big part of his trip to Korea. How do you think Kim Jong-Un reacts to the focus on human rights, and does that play an important role in our diplomacy with the North and in terms of the pressure campaign?
Yeah, on repairing the alliance, I might say I don't think it's bad. Again, I think we're in a better position than I had expected with Moon. So, I think there's always going to be friction. I mean, it just happens with allies or spouses. So, what I would say looking ahead, and I think General Gregson already telegraphed it, was, when we have this special measures agreement discussion, this negotiations, it may even start at the end of this month or next month, it's talking about money. Things get contentious. And the president last year during the campaign had said basically 100% reimbursement or we walk. I think going into that, as well as the Chorus Free Trade Agreement renegotiations, the message would be sort of, look, we're going to go into some, contentious, discussions with our trusted ally and partner and fellow democracy. It's going to talk about money, so it might get a bit heated. So we're going to go behind closed doors and we're going to, hash it out. And we have some concerns about some of the implementation of the Chorus Free Trade Agreement. I'm sure our partners have some reciprocal concerns, and we'll let you know when we come out of the room. Next question, please. And the same with SMA. I think if it's a trusted friend and ally, you don't kind of hash it out too much out in public, because then it can strain relations. And then if the relations are strained, then any little thing can be exacerbated and seen as a sign of mistrust. Human rights, absolutely. I think too often we overlook North Korean human rights atrocities because we're focused on nukes and missiles. So, we try to bring that out more in the forefront. It often gets overlooked. I think the president, in both his speech in the National Assembly in Seoul and the State of the Union address, I thought it was great, commenting about North Korean human rights, to kind of mention the nature of the regime that folks want to negotiate with. and we can't lose sight of that. Not only is Pyongyang a threat to its neighbors, but also to its citizens. So, some interpreted the State of the Union as kind of the dehumanizing your opponent as a way of, leading up to attacking them, kind of like Bush did before going into Iraq. I think that's reading the tea leaves a little too intently. I thought in the speech, he said his policy is maximum pressure. He kind of forgot to add an engagement. I would have liked more details, but that's, just me. But I thought it's good to bring up the human rights. Seeing Otto Warmbier's parents, that is gut-wrenching. No parent should ever bury their child. And then the escapee, that is all very, very moving. So I thought it was good.
So next, the gentleman right there, please. He's been waiting a bit.
Paul Goldstein, Strategic Renaissance. I'd like to push the envelope a little bit, and what are the prospects of South Korea, Japan, and even Taiwan going nuclear if we operate on the principle that North Korea is going to have nuclear weapons?
I would think that the prospects of them going nuclear is much, much higher if we allow North Korea to exert leverage that breaks the alliance. This is why I think we need to double down on our relations with our allies over there. Fun fact, while we were talking about here in this country about allies not pulling their weight, 100% reimbursement, et cetera, the 4 largest military construction projects since World War II are all in Northeast Asia. 2 of them say made in Japan in total. Marine Corps Air Station Iwakuni and its continued expansion, and Marine Corps Air Station Futenma. One says made in Japan about 40%, and that's the buildup of Guam, which is an American territory. And the last one, the 4th one, and this is not in order of the money invested, is Camp Humphreys in Korea, paid for totally by the Koreans. So instead of lambasting our allies with conventional wisdom, garnered from the rumor mill, what we needed to start. This pertains also to Dave Maxwell's question, to start rebuilding trust amongst our allies. Is we need a heck of a lot of public diplomacy that talks a hell of a lot more about our allies and what's right about our allies than about North Korea. And human rights fits right in that. You go back and you look at the way we talked during the Cold War, both to our allies and friends, to our enemies, and to ourselves. It's fundamentally different than the way we talk now. And we started losing our ability to do this in 1989 when the single organizing principle that governed all our policies and strategies went away. The Soviet Union collapsed. Colin Powell asked his little private think tank in the Pentagon at that time, what do we do now that we're losing our best enemy? Because we had nothing to plan against anymore. We need to get back to that. North Korea is probably the most odious regime in the globe for their human rights, and this is saying something with Ceausescu and others. And we need to get back to talking about this. And yeah, people are going to say the United States is not perfect either. Right, we acknowledge that, but we need to go forward with this. And this is part of rebuilding trust amongst the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The passive diplomacy that we're doing now, the passive deterrence, the sort of admiring the military problem, what we're doing with the readiness gradually declining with the forces over there, and we've recently had accidents that have indicated that this is the state of things. Hello, wake-up call. We need to move forward. But yes, there is no there's no lack of ability in any of those 3 countries that you mentioned that with the asterisk on one that would prevent them from going nuclear in a very short time. So.
Yeah.
George,
yeah, I can work it in later.
You hit one of my hot buttons.
Eric Gomez from Cato. As South Korea has sort of developed especially since 2010, has been working on sort of unilateral response options and with wanting to have operational control of their forces in a conflict, developing things like kill chain, KMPR, and Korea air and missile defense. I was wondering what this does for freedom of action. So things like, as South Korea improves unilateral response capabilities, does this allow the United States to be a bit more flexible in terms of the policy options we can adopt? Does it reduce fears of a wedge in the alliance if South Korea is able to have a more robust self-defense capability. So that way, so to me, the biggest problem with a wedge in the alliance is that it enables North Korea to reunify the peninsula on its terms more easily. But if South Korea has a strong self-defensive capability that could function with or without the United States, does that then make that option harder for North Korea to achieve, and therefore we don't have to, therefore we can allow them to have the negotiations with the North without the fears of the wedge? So just this sort of general comment on what does a better or more robust South Korean conventional capability do for South Korea's freedom of action politically and ours?
If I might just quickly go back to the nuke thing. Taiwan, I don't know. I'm just a simple Korea-Japan guy. Japan, anyone advocating for nuke weapons for Japan is like a really minor fringe element. It's not going to happen. I mean, the aversion to nuclear in Japan, it's just you're not going to get a nuke weapons program. I mean, they're nervous enough about Abe just wanting to change some of the wording on Article 9 of the Constitution. South Korea, you'll see some polls showing a majority are in favor of it. South Korean polls are very fickle. And I think also they don't realize things like, okay, where are you going to get your fissile material? You get all of it from the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and they would cut you off, including for your civilian reactors, and you can drain your reactors, and then you don't have any fissile material for your reactors. For electricity, you would be a pariah. You may face sanctions, and you're going to be spending a lot of money to recreate something we're given for free. Why would you do that and not spend it on the stuff you should? And the previous and the current South Korean administration saying we're not going down that path, and they've also come out against even reintroducing U.S. TAC nukes, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. On South Korea, we welcome them increasing their military capabilities. I mean, we're always hoping allies do more. With South Korea, because of demographics, they are not going to have enough 18-year-olds by 2025 to fill all the slots they needed. So they are going from 625,000 down to 500,000. To offset that decrease in quantity, they are pledging to increase quality. And back in the No Mu-Hun administration, it was called Defense Reform Plan 2020, which, because of the not putting enough budget to it, it became 2025. And then now you've got DRP 1230, 307, and I think it has a new name. So we're always encouraging them to, sort of purchase or deploy the things that we think they should need. Sometimes there's a tendency to buy shiny objects instead of kind of boring things like C4ISR, which are maybe more important. So, I think the militaries are working closely on try to urge them to buy what we think they should, not just because we're selling it, but don't buy things to duplicate what we're already bringing to the table. But if the plan right now for wartime OPCON is we go from supporting to supported command, but we're still there. And as long as we've got a treaty, and as long as South Korea wants us there, we'll fulfill our commitments. If they say, "Thank you very much, we want you to go home," I mean, we're not an occupying army, so we'd have to go home. We'd try to convince them not to do that because we don't think it's in their interest or our interest.
So maybe we can bundle up the last few questions since we're starting out of time. So I know, sir, you had a question. Maybe we can get these last three, and then our panelists can respond. Prashant, we'll just go right around. If everybody can ask them, and then we'll kind of give our final thoughts.
Prashant Parmeswaran with the Diplomat magazine. So my question relates to broader South Korean foreign policy under the Moon government. So we've seen, as obviously the focus on North Korea has been there, the new administration has taken some, I guess, interesting diplomatic initiatives, some of them related to this old conception of South Korea as a middle power, but increasing engagements with India, with Southeast Asia, and some other countries in the Asia-Pacific. So I'm wondering, and also I guess I should throw in the South Korean defense minister recently proposed the idea of a new maritime forum in the Asia-Pacific, and when they're organizing the International Fleet Review later this year, they're trying to propose the idea and roll it out. I'm wondering how much of this is, do you view as serious and substantive? We've seen this before. And to what extent does this give the United States an opportunity as it's unveiling the Indo-Pacific strategy for a more positive conception of how to think about South Korea in the Asia-Pacific and the neighborhood? Thanks.
Why don't we get the question right next to him? I think there's a gentleman. Sir, do you have one?
No.
Oh.
Thank you. My name is Michitaka Kaya from the Yomiuri Shimbun, Japanese newspaper company. And since it's so difficult to convince Kim Jong to give up nuclear program, is there any possibility that President Trump recognize North Korea as nuclear state if Kim Jong promised to give up only ICBM program, which can hit U.S.? So the President Trump can say we have a good deal and now United States is safe, but it's worst scenario for Japanese government. That's very big concern Japanese government have.
I think I have one last question on the left right here. Right.
Joe Bosco, DOD. My question was to General Gregson, my old boss, but it's been asked and answered.
All right.
You're letting me off easy, Joe, for a change. Prasant, you raise an interesting point, as always. In an ideal world, we shouldn't object to the ROK having vigorous diplomacy with everybody, to include North Korea, but we need to have some vigorous diplomacy with South Korea ourselves first, and or at the same time. We've had delegations go off to visit North Korea without any South Koreans along, and that makes the South Koreans very nervous. We need to, if it works, if it works us toward the right place, then I think we should welcome it. To include the maritime thing that you talked about, South Korea has always had kind of a tension between whether they're a part of the continent of Asia, or whether they're a maritime nation. I would argue with their peninsulas, so they're obviously maritime in my book, and their increased involvement in the maritime sector, I think, would be very important. I know the Japanese would appreciate more Aegis ships in South Korea that could contribute to the regional defense. On the Yomiuri Shimbun question of recognition, I certainly hope not. But then again, that's one of the themes that I was trying to talk about, that one of the real things we need to be worried here is that behind the nuclear shield, Kim Jong-Un can work to damage our alliances with the Republic of Korea and with Japan, and that makes restoring faith among the allies and building trust and confidence among the allies ever more important, and that means a raft of things, both diplomatic, political, economic, and military.
On sort of South Korea punching above its weight or looking beyond the peninsula, I think it's great. Under Lee Myung-bak, he had a global Korea initiative, which seemed to have withered a bit under Park Geun-hye, and maybe now this is a bit of a resurrection, though it's politics, so you can't call it the same thing. When South Korea reaches out, it doesn't always have to be in lockstep with the U.S., either because they have different interests or it shows that the concern South Korea has, if they parallel the U.S., then it's not just the U.S. pushing them to do things. Like if it's maritime issues in the South China Sea, it's like, hey, it's not just a U.S.-China issue, it's the countries in the region. I remember a South Korean National Assembly member telling me that, when South Korea reaches out to Southeast Asia, it's good because they're sort of coming in like, hi, we're an example of what happens when you engage with the U.S., poor country, not a democracy, and yet with all the U.S., the support and the shield and the economic support, look where we are now. Now we're sort of, an indirect ambassador for what countries can benefit from when they engage with the U.S. So, I think that's, all to our benefit. And for South Korea it is a small country, but it's incredibly capable economically and everything. So having them look beyond just the wolf closest to the sled, I think, is a great thing. We've had even their military doing things in Somali pirates, et cetera. On will the administration recognize North Korea as a nuclear power? No. Or belay that. Hell no. And as General Gregson said, sort of capital R, little r. I say kind of accept and assess. You might assess that, they've got nuke weapons, but you don't accept them, and you maintain the pressure as long as they are in violation of UN resolutions.
South Korea even makes washers that we're afraid of.
And phones.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody, for coming with us today. Thank you.